Hey guys, it's Corey with 10 Best Ones, and today we've decided to review the 5 best options for you. If you'd like to see their price and find out more information, you can check out the links in the description down below. Let's get started. We are going to start this list with the best budget option that you can get your hands on.
Number 5. AMD Ryzen 3 3300X. With the Ryzen 3 3300X, AMD pushes its Zen 2 silicon into the mainstream and budget desktop market to devastating effect. The Ryzen 3 3300X is one of 2 new chips launching today, the other being the equally intriguing Ryzen 3 3100, and both are representative of everything AMD is doing right in 2020. The company also took this launch to announce its upcoming AMD B550 chipset, which will make it even more affordable for amateur content creators and multiplayer gamers to get the power they need on a tight budget for a new build. The AMD Ryzen 3 3300X gives creators and mainstream gamers a new CPU price tier to think about, and upgraders with compatible AMD AM4 motherboards a new cheap upgrade option. With the launch of the Zen 2 line of chips last year came a fresh line of motherboards based on a new chipset, the AMD X570, and with it support for the much discussed PCI Express 4.0 or PCIe 4.0 bus standard. For speed demons who are trying to keep costs down, the investment in the AMD X570 platform, which is the only current one on AMD's AM4 socket that's wired for PCIe 4.0, might be too big of a jump. So who's got the motherboards in our budget? Well, for starters, these new Ryzen 3 chips will work on existing AM4 motherboards provided that the motherboard maker's BIOS supports the new chips. Earlier AMD AM4 socket boards like those based on the B450 and A320 chipsets won't do PCIe 4.0, but for most budget-minded shoppers that doesn't matter at all. While the higher end of the 3rd generation Ryzen stack is more than a bit overkill for gamers, a 4-core 8-thread budget CPU is very well positioned to become the next big processor that powers Fortnite and CSGO machines around the world in concert with a complementary video card. The Ryzen 3 3300X should be a top CPU contender for anyone building a fast but budget-conscious AMD AM4 based gaming desktop or a content creation PC equipped with a dedicated video card.
Next up, we have a model which gives you the best value for your money.
Number 4. AMD Ryzen 5 3600X. AMD throws in support for PCIe 4.0, superior power efficiency, an auto-overclocking tool, and capable bundled cooler, making the Ryzen 5 3600X the best mid-range processor on the market. Intel dominated this segment for years, but AMD's Ryzen processors have made inroads with the company's typical advantage of more cores and threads for less money. Pair that with the less expensive motherboards, bundled coolers, and unrestricted overclocking for all Ryzen 5 models, and AMD offers a compelling alternative with its previous gen parts. While AMD is coming closer to charging premium pricing for its parts, it's logical to expect to pay more for faster chips. AMD undoubtedly holds the crown for performance in multi-threaded workloads like productivity applications as a side benefit of supporting multi-threading in this price range, while Intel disables the feature. But the Ryzen chips have historically lagged Intel in gaming. That changes with the Ryzen 5 3600X, which upsets the Core i5 9600K in our testing. Pair that performance advantage with leading performance in threaded applications, and the 3600X is one of the best gaming CPUs you can buy. A new leading chip for the mainstream. Like the other Ryzen 3000 chips, the 6-core 12-thread Ryzen 5 3600X comes with a 7nm compute die with 2 disabled physical cores, paired with a 12nm I/O die. These 2 components come together into a single package that adheres to a 95-watt TDP ceiling, while the lesser Ryzen 5 3600, which has the same complement of features but lower clocks, comes with a 65-watt rating. With all of Ryzen 5 3600X's advantages, aside from higher overclocking ceilings or integrated graphics, there are very few reasons to buy a competing Intel processor in this price range. The Ryzen 5 3600X has stolen the mid-range crown from Intel.
If you're looking for a mid-range model, then this next pick is a great option.
Number 3. AMD Ryzen 7 3700X. AMD's third-generation Ryzen CPUs boast higher clock speeds and more cores than the previous first and second-gen parts, and the Ryzen 7 3700X is now one of the best CPUs for gaming. Zen 2 CPUs are so good that AMD almost doesn't need the faster offerings. Its second-string 3700X is perfectly capable of running the offense, and it isn't quite as demanding when it comes to signing bonuses and contracts. Maximum boost clocks on the 3800X are only 100 MHz higher than the 3700X, but minimum guaranteed clocks are potentially 300 MHz higher. In practice, however, the 3700X mostly runs well above the minimum clock speed, particularly in light to medium workloads. If you do a lot of 3D rendering or video encoding, moving to the Ryzen 9 3900X makes sense, but for everyone else, the 3700X is a great choice. You sacrifice boost clocks for higher all-core clocks, though with the 3700X there's at least a bit more gain from enabling precision boost overdrive. It's still only 200 MHz extra at best, which means less than a 5% improvement, and often in the 1 to 3% range. The days of massive gains via overclocking your CPU are largely behind us now. Intel's Core i9-9900K might get an extra 400 MHz versus stock, and AMD CPUs might get an extra 200 to 300 MHz, which just isn't that exciting. It's the blessing and curse of increased competition. Out of 10 games tested, the 3700X and 3900X are pretty much tied, with the 3900X hanging onto a scant 0.5% lead in frame rates. That's well within margin of error, and that's with an RTX 2080 Ti at 1080p, move up to 1440p or 4K, or downgrade to a slower GPU, and the gap would almost completely disappear. Anyone looking at building an AMD-based PC will find a lot to like with the Ryzen 7 3700X. It's basically as fast as the more expensive third-gen Ryzen parts when it comes to gaming, and certainly fast enough for most other tasks.
Before we talk about the best model overall, let's look at the runner-up for this list.
Number 2. AMD Ryzen 9 3900X. This processor packs 12 cores and 24 threads in a mainstream package for the first time, and does it at a similar price point as the Intel Core i9-9900K, a processor with just 8 cores and 16 threads. The AMD Ryzen 9 3900X marks yet another blast from Team Red, ramping up the intensity of the AMD vs Intel processor war. Still though, there's more than just core counts when it comes to a mainstream processor. A single core performance needs to be on point, especially if you're hoping to play the best PC games. Now we're asking ourselves whether or not the AMD Ryzen 9 3900X finally dethrones the Intel Core i9-9900K as the de facto ruler of the mainstream processors. Ultimately, it depends. The 3900X doesn't reach the same single-core performance as Intel, but we're starting to see more games adopt multi-threaded CPUs, so that doesn't matter as much. AMD Ryzen 3rd generation and the Zen 2 architecture itself is notable because it leads 7nm processors to the mainstream for the first time. But there's a lot more going on under the hood than just a smaller manufacturing node. The most important improvement, and the easiest to understand, is the massive increase to IPC, or instructions per clock. AMD claims it was able to increase IPCs in its third-generation Ryzen chips by up to 15%, which goes a long way to explaining why single-core performance sees such a boost over something like the AMD Ryzen 7 2700X. That increased IPC improvement, along with the massive turbo boost of 4.6 GHz, mean that even in single-core performance, long a weak link of AMD's processors comes within reaching distance of Team Blue's chips. One thing that the switch to 7nm silicon has allowed for, however, is an increase in cache size. AMD is now describing its L3 and L2 cache in a combined spec of game cache, even though it's basically the same thing. Over the last couple of years, AMD has been reaching for dominance in the desktop CPU world, and with the AMD Ryzen 9 3900X, it's finally there.
Finally, the next model is the best overall. From us, it gets a perfect score in all categories.
Number 1. Intel Core i5-10600K. The Intel Core i5-10600K isn't the world's fastest gaming processor, but this 6-core 12-thread chip will arguably be a better CPU pick than the Core i9-10900K for most humans. The 10900K is the flagship 10th generation Comet Lake CPU, and the proud owner of that world's fastest gaming processor badge. It's also the first mainstream 10-core processor Intel has ever produced, taking the 14nm architecture essentially as far as it can go, and demanding a huge amount of power and cooling in order to get there. Core i5 and Core i3 chips are now able to stand toe-to-toe with their Ryzen competition in terms of both cores and threads, and with a certain leveling out of pricing that almost entirely takes away the draw of AMD's mid-range CPUs. I say almost because there are still platform-specific reasons why the Ryzen 3000 series processors are tempting, most especially because of the imminent release of the B550 motherboards with budget pricing, competitive performance, and PCIe 4.0 support. Intel is, however, still the gamer's choice, and Comet Lake has certainly cemented that position despite using both an aging production process and geriatric CPU architecture. The key spec for the 10600K is the core and thread count, with the number of CPU cores in mainstream processors having skyrocketed since AMD got good. The Core i5 range has seen its own rise, though not necessarily in kind. To compete with the 6-core 12-thread Ryzen 5 range, Intel chose to drop 6 cores into the Core i5 lineup with the first Coffee Lake release, but it's only with Comet Lake that those chips have been able to fully match the AMD processors on all counts. With 6 cores and 12 threads running at 4.5 GHz on all cores and up to 4.8 GHz on a single core, the Core i5 10600K has a great deal of potential on all counts. That means you're looking at another 300 MHz on top of the base clock of the last gen 9600K and another 200 MHz on top of the max turbo frequency. Like the other K-series CPUs of the Comet Lake generation, the 10600K has a 125-watt TDP up from the 95 watts of the previous 6-core i5 chips. So yeah, more power for more speeds. With a combination of its overclocking prowess and the extra boost of hyper-threading, the Core i5 Silicon is now a fantastic option for pure gamers, and now for those doing anything a little more processor-intensive on the side too. Buying guide. Firstly, AMD vs Intel. There are two main CPU manufacturers when it comes to desktop PCs and laptops, AMD and Intel. Until 2017, unless you were going ultra-budget, Intel was the only real choice. Today, our CPU buying guide can be quite different. Whether you opt for an AMD or an Intel CPU, as long as you buy the right one for what you want to do with your new system, you'll have a fantastic experience. One important note, however, is that if you are planning to build a computer, you must buy compatible components. An Intel motherboard will not work with an AMD CPU, and vice versa. Secondly, cores and threads. If you want to know how to choose a CPU, you need to consider cores and threads. Cores are like individual processors of their own, all packed together on the same chip. Traditionally, they can perform one task each at a time, meaning that more cores makes a processor better at multitasking. Modern software is far better at taking advantage of more cores at once to do the same job, so more cores can make some software work faster too. Threads are the number of tasks that a CPU can conduct at any one time. Many modern processors feature simultaneous multi-threading, called hyper-threading on Intel CPUs, which lets each core perform 2 tasks at once. And thirdly, integrated graphics. CPUs can also include integrated graphics chips on the same die, making them capable of operating independently of dedicated graphics cards. Intel CPUs with the F designation, such as the 9900KF, don't have onboard graphics, but most others do in some form. They aren't typically powerful, but an entry-level integrated graphics chip like the UHD 620 can do between 30 and 60 FPS in older esports games like CSGO. Thanks for watching. I hope you liked the video. If you found it helpful, please remember to leave a like and subscribe to my channel to see more videos like this in the future. If you have any questions related to these products, you can leave a comment below and I'll get back to you as soon as I can.